Hey again, U.S. history students, it's Mr. Baker, Baker's Corner. Hope you are doing really well. We're going to try to wrap up our year by connecting a few dots, so to speak, on a couple of the big themes. If you've been following your modules the last week or so, then you have basically gone through some of the earlier 90s kinds of trends and things like that, and some of the political things. So what we want to do today is to try to connect, socially and also to an extent from the standpoint of culture, what is kind of affecting the United States, as we transition into especially the late night or 20th, pardon me, and also our earlier 21st century. And then we want to spend just a few minutes kind of reflecting upon the last really big thing that we'll get to with our course, which is this transition to the war on terrorism. And we'll spend just a few minutes on that, since it's something that tends to get a lot of attention as we transition into the early 21st century. But just really quick, here we get started. So when we're looking at social cultural trends, there's a lot of different things that we can focus on. But what I like to really focus on, guys, is how is the cultural landscape of the country going to be changing, basically because of new groups that are moving in. Now, immigration trends, keep in mind, are nothing new to our study of American history. We've talked about, if you go back to the 1840s with the larger influx of the Irish and also the German population, and then toward the 1880s and until about 1920-ish, you see that new immigration of a lot of people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Well, if you look back at what we said briefly during the era of President Johnson being LBJ, basically what we notice is that his policy is going to really open up more opportunity for breaking down some of those larger scale quotas that were in place. And we notice something that's not exact, but somewhat in some cases connected in 1990 with this Immigration Act. Okay. And keep in mind who was in office in 1990. That's going to be the first H.W. Bush, Bush 41, Bush the Elder, whatever you want to refer to him as, Daddy Bush. So Bush Part Two, which some people call his son's presidency, has a lot to do with educational policy, but we'll get to that more in just a moment. Okay. And so if you think about it, the big picture here is you're looking at a lot of immigration that is going to be changing. And if you think about it, what groups are we going to start to see the most? And the answer to the question is immigrants from where? We're going to see a huge influx of basically immigrants that are coming from parts of Latin America and also parts of Asia. Okay. And so again, that cultural landscape. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, well, do we have things like Chinatown and some of those ethnic neighborhoods? Of course we do, right? Those go way far back to, the 1800s and so forth. But what we notice is that you're going to see larger numbers. And so it's going to be really important to be able to distinguish between, for example, when you're talking about a part of the world that's South Asia, and you're focusing on India, that when you're talking about East Asia, you're looking at places like South Korea, parts of China, and then of course also parts of Japan, right? So we're going to see a lot of influx of immigrants in larger numbers. Okay, think about the effects of that, right? What effect is that going to have on things like language and customs and traditions? And some of those are already there, sure, right? But the idea of trying to, if you're a first generation immigrant, keep in mind, we've talked about this before, you see a lot of emphasis on, in some cases, the parents really wanting to maintain that sense of original culture. And then, of course, for different reasons, whether it's kids going to public school or whatever, you're going to see a lot of focus on them being kind of transitioned into American society, right? Whatever that means to become Americanized. Okay. And so what do we notice? Yeah, again, we've talked about this before, the idea of nativism, right? Kind of goes in what you call almost like a roller coaster ride, where it kind of resurfaces because of changes and things. And that's not going to be a lot different, but it is going to be something that you see almost like a resurgence of. Okay. And guys, remember, basic nuts and bolts definition of nativism is basically a movement where you have a focus on, let's say, natural born Americans wanting the government to protect, whether it's rights or whatever you want to call it, basically the interests of the natural born population. Okay. One distinction to make is that that does not necessarily mean that people are anti-immigrant. Okay. It just basically means in a way that, they have a desire to have some degree of protection, et cetera. Right. So just something to keep in mind. There's different, ways that people interpret that. Okay. The green card to legal immigrants, you're talking about them entering the country with legal status to be able to do things like work and reside. One big thing to keep in mind is that the idea of becoming a naturalized citizen upon, entering the country is not required by law. It's certainly encouraged to be able to have things like political rights to vote, etc. Okay, but nonetheless, the idea of green cards is pretty important. Okay, and then another couple of things that are more related, I would say, to just population that can be here. But again, movement. Guys, keep in mind, we're a culture of people that in some cases like to relocate, we like to move. And the idea of the Sun Belt, right, is going to become a lot of migration within the country. Those of you that like sports, a lot of you guys are familiar with sports teams like, the San Francisco Giants were not originally the San Francisco Giants, right? They were located in New York. Similar thing with Brooklyn Dodgers, right? You take a look at some of the expansion of sports into places like South Florida with the Dolphins and Tampa, which would be more northwestern Florida, or at least more northern. Okay, so you notice because of population movement, right? Whether, in case of Florida, you also have a state income tax and a variety of different reasons. Even Nevada's, Las Vegas particularly is a well-known city. You notice a lot of relocation. Okay, so the map here, again, this is a little bit outdated, but just to show you, you're noticing, again, a lot of losses from these countries that you'll notice I have the cursor on as far as population, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York. A lot of times you'll see or hear the word Rust Belt thrown around for a lot of those, states or even cities like Cleveland would be about right there, Detroit, Michigan, the idea of even, Steel City, USA, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, places like that, that have been losing population to, of course, as you can see, countries, states that are located, as you can see, in parts of the Sun Belt. Okay, Arizona, even the city of Phoenix. I think Phoenix is in the top 5, definitely the top 10 of American cities as far as size, population size. That, of course, has changed over the last 40 or 50 years, right? So those are things to keep in mind when you're looking, guys, at cultural change and then also, of course, demographics. Okay, and then the question is, what is this reign of America idea? Okay, so when we think of gray, we think a lot of times of maybe, color, as far as like, on the color spectrum or whatever. But guys, in this case, we're really looking at the idea of a concept of America is getting older as far as the population of people that are living, beyond 65, et cetera, right? So think about 2 programs that were created that you can see on the slide here that were created, one in the 1930s and then the other one was created about 30 years later in the 1960s. That would be Social Security and also Medicare. Okay, so both of those are programs, as we've learned before and talked about. Why are those important? They provide a lot of resources. They provide a lot of safety net, you could argue, for the population of Americans. Now, you can, look at people that get Social Security support that are not just 62 and older, but nonetheless Medicare, and you're mostly looking at the age 65 and above. Okay, and so the question is, okay, why is the graying of America something that obviously is important? Well, when you have a population of people that are relying on these programs, right, and you have a population of people that are actually paying into them, keep in mind you have fewer people as far as the ratios paying into recipients, that's going to put a degree of strain on those two programs. And so that's the reason why this is such a big thing. You know, those of you that have grandparents and even people that, you know, neighbors, et cetera, that are 65 and older, they're starting to maybe transition to Medicare and Social Security benefits. You know, those are things that when you look at this big group, guys, remember we had a sizable group of Americans that we call the baby boomers that were born between about 1945 and around 1963 or so, give or take. And that means that as of 2010, right, a lot of that, you know, earlier wave of baby boomers are now qualifying for a lot of those benefits, right? And so as you can imagine, that is something that, you know, it does affect. You know, you hear all these different things about, you know, Social Security, and is it going to be solvent, right? That's a key word that you come across, which basically means, is it going to be sustainable, right, for the population that follows the current generation of people that are obviously receiving those benefits. Okay. And so anyway, so, you know, we're in election year 2020, and this is not a political video, but I would encourage students and even other people that are watching, you know, to, you know, if you watch the presidential debates and some of the dialogue leading up to the election, these are things that usually get a lot of attention, right? So definitely important to keep in mind. Okay, as far as emphasis on school, just a real quick headline on this. Um, Obviously, when you have an America that the cultural dynamic is changing, different sets of people, different groups, they're bringing different languages, customs, traditions, religions, etc. Okay, then what you see, guys, from time to time is with especially the public education system, right, which, you know, is very inclusive of a lot of those cultural identities. The question is, okay, you know, do we focus on something like multiculturalism, right? African American Heritage Month. I think it is October. That's Hispanic Awareness Month, etc. Okay, and those are things again that you know, hopefully you're emphasizing Native American heritage, culture. The list goes on and on. Okay, Asian American. Okay, and with that being said, the question that comes up quite a bit is, you know, when you look across the pond to, you know, countries that are so close in Europe, you know, that have, you know, French, of course, being spoken predominantly in parts of France. You know, you go to a place like Germany, German, Spain, which is pretty close in proximity Spanish. I mean, you see so much emphasis on not just multiculturalism, but also the idea of dynamics of language. Okay, that's one thing that comes up quite a bit. Okay, so that's kind of one of those big things with American public education is, you know, are we emphasizing the bilingual nature of the importance of learning multiple languages? Okay, and I know in the state of North Carolina, students are, you know, I think they, you know, on the college track, they are not just encouraged, but I think the expectation is that they will have taken 2 years of foreign language. But, you know, in addition to that, the idea of becoming functional, right, is something that's pretty important. Okay. And then last but not least, just to kind of end with this segment really quick is, and this kind of transitions us to the first few years of the W. Bush, or Bush 43, as he's also known as, presidency. And that's going to be one of the things that early, I think it was in 2002 or three, Congress is going to put forth with his support what became known as the No Child Left Behind law. Big picture here is you're looking at the federal government becoming more involved in some oversight of public education, providing funding, trying to make it to where there are, you know, ways in more detail to be able to see that children are moving from grade level to grade level. And as a result of that, the one thing that you notice is that you have this focus on this grade level mastery. Okay. Now, one thing that students a lot of times groan when this is brought up is the idea of standardized testing. Standardized testing is nothing new. However, there is a school of thought out there that, you know, as, you know, we see more, you know, resources being thrown at education, whether it's federal government or whether it's states or what have you, that there's a bigger amount of emphasis on the idea of accountability to see that students really are mastering that. Okay, as you can imagine, the idea of wanting to see students that are on par is a good thing. The other side of the coin is with accountability, does it create a situation where it takes away more opportunity for creativity with the curriculum because you're so streamlined on hitting really more stringent educational or standards? Okay. And so you all can land your plane on whether you think that's good or not. But at the end of the day, one of the bigger things that came out of this was the idea of wanting kids. And you could say, well, Mr. Baker, isn't the whole point of education to begin with? Yes. But I remember in the 2000 election, when then Governor Bush of Texas was debating then VP Gore. Of course, one of the big things that they debated was this issue, and I think it was W that made the comment. He said, "I just want the money and resources that states are getting from the federal government. We want them to be able to show some degree of results." Okay, so something to ponder. And with that being said, we'll do a very quick overview of one of the biggest things that defines the early 20th century, which is the war on terrorism. Okay. I'm sure the students, as of 3 years ago, kind of an interesting little transition, I started to see my first wave of students that some of them were actually not born before, of course, 9/11 happened. Before then, it was, when I first started teaching this back in 03, 04, most of my students had been in middle school, right, teaching mostly juniors. And so they had some degree of knowledge about where they were, what they were doing. Certainly talked to their parents a little bit about it, but they could give some firsthand background, similar to what you all are probably going to be having your, maybe future children or nephews, nieces, whoever you interact with about the current COVID thing. Okay, they were able to give some firsthand reflection on that. And so one thing I want to point out is this, first of all, is that there's not, to my knowledge, you can see what terrorism is defined as and different resources, but there is a degree of variation to these definitions. Okay, so I won't get into a lot of this, but just a couple of things to keep in your noggin is, when you're looking at a very basic definition, this is one. Both these definitions I've taken from multiple resources to try to give as much of a balanced definition. In other words, as little bias as I could possibly find. Okay, but the idea of terrorism, keep in mind, this is not just the things that a lot of times we think of with 9/11, but also domestic terrorism, like in '95 with Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombings. It's very easy to overlook those things, but keep in mind this is a very broad definition of the term. But it says violent acts which are intended to create fear, carried out for an ideological goal, and target the safety of civilians. Okay, so we all know about 9/11. We know about the Twin Towers. We know about the eventual Pentagon, the flight that went down in southern Pennsylvania that was probably hitting, I think it's safe to say, toward the White House or definitely another government building in D.C. What do we notice? We notice that those are big things that come to our attention. Okay, so shortly after, as we'll see on the next couple of slides, guys, this is where then President W has only been in office, keep in mind, this happened, of course, 9/11 in 2001. He took office January 20th of the same year. So that's a really eye-opening event to basically get your feet wet, so to speak, in the presidency, right? When I think of that, I think of events like, the stock market crash. By no means are they the same exact event. Let's make that clear. But the idea of really having to be faced with a tragedy of any circles like that within a few months of office is going to be something that he has some decisions to make on, as we'll see here in a second. Okay. And so a good basic working definition of the war on terrorism: military, political, legal, and ideological conflict against Islamic terrorism, Islamic militants, and the regimes and or organizations tied to them. I think one thing that very much needs to be understood here is that we are not talking about a war on Islam as a religion. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. America does have some good relationships with countries that do have majority of Muslim, populations. Okay. But when we're looking at basically, going into, Afghanistan, with the Taliban and of course, Al Qaeda and other places or other groups like that, there is a tie to Islamic, some Islamic connection there. Okay. And so we'll come back to that. So the social impact, if you've flown, especially if you flew, pre 9/11 as opposed to post 9/11. I like to tell the story when I was a little baby, 4 months old. I don't remember this, but evidently the story is my mom was on a plane with me from Columbus, Ohio to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, which is where my aunt lived at the time. And evidently I was teething. And I was not a very pleasant infant or baby on that flight. And so once they got to the gate, of course, you walk out the gate, and here's usually the people waiting to greet. And my aunt was all excited, and my mom was like, "Take this child. I'm done with him. He's been crying the whole 2 hours." Okay. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, if you've flown, that is not the way that we actually are going to greet people. It's usually going to be at places like the baggage claim, or even outside the terminals. Okay. And so a couple of things to keep in mind is that you are going to see some changes in regards to airport security. And the other thing that tends to get a lot of attention is the Patriot Act, right? With giving, a pretty strong degree of opportunity for, surveillance in regards to trying to reduce the threat of terrorist activity. Okay. As you can imagine, this was passed shortly after 9/11. It's not popular by every portion of the American population for a variety of different reasons. Some people would argue it kind of falls into a similar category with like the Espionage and Sedition Acts, going back to the 1917 time of World War I, and then even the Alien and Espionage Acts at the time of the John Adams presidency in the later 1890s. Okay, but at the end of the day, the question is, you can see there, is it a limit on civil liberties, and is it a necessary thing, or even some people would argue an emergency power in the time of a war, all right, or a potential emergency? Okay. And military impact, not to spend too much time on this, but keep in mind, when we think of the war on terrorism, a lot of times a couple of big events, or at least aspects of this, should come to mind. Of course, the picture of Osama bin Laden is obviously a pretty important detail for us to keep in mind. But the idea of us making it an objective, with taking down the Taliban, that was basically supporting and basically you could say protecting, Osama bin Laden. And then also, of course, the big thing that gets a lot of attention is the war in Iraq, right? So going in to topple the administration, or shall we say the leadership of Saddam Hussein. And the argument is that, why did we do it? Was there clear evidence? Well, the thought was he supporting terrorist organizations? And maybe in a different way too, did he have weapons of mass destruction that if they got in the hands of terrorists or other groups, that would not bode well for the United States and, of course, our allies. Okay. And so you see the term preemptive strike there. Okay. And so the idea of, preemptive, the word preemptive meaning before, we're really looking at pressure to basically take him out, talking about Saddam Hussein and his regime, before some more extreme damage could be done. Okay. And so that really creates, obviously a lot of support, but it also creates, years later, as we've reflected on that, some people would say, well, man, did we really discover, the threat that, some people thought that we had? Okay. George H.W. Bush does expand, the idea of threats beyond just places like Iraq and also Al Qaeda, right? So this axis of evil, focusing on North Korea, other groups as well, are going to be, really big amounts of attention that he brings to this idea. Okay, and then last but not least, politically, the idea of this war on terrorism we know is going to be very divisive, with us or kind of against us. Okay. Good sound bites, but the question is, is that giving any countries really a degree of wiggle room or neutrality? Okay. And I'll end with this, but something to keep in mind. One thing that comes up with the W. Bush administration or presidency certainly is his legacy, and the war on terrorism is certainly going to be something that if you know anything about his presidential library that they opened just a few years ago, there's a lot of focus on documents and certainly things that could be looked at within that presidential library. Okay, one thing that he does shortly after, and we say he as in his administration, is basically creating a separate kind of like a department called the Department of Homeland Security that is completely pretty much focused on the idea of protecting the homeland against another, potential large scale attack. Okay. So, think about it like this. This is kind of the end of our journey, which is a little bit bittersweet, but ask yourself the question with all these themes for the year, just a big overarching question. We have a lot of people that are watching these that are in their later high school years. I remember when I was a senior in high school back in 92, 93, I used to ask myself, well, what is America going to look like when I'm middle age, right? And whether you still consider 40s or early 50s or whatever it might be to be middle age, that's the question I would leave you all with. What is America going to look like politically, socially, economically, culturally, etc.? Okay, as you all transition to this life of not just young adulthood, but adulthood, and you start to become more active citizens in our society. Thank you for your time. Hope you're doing well. Stay safe. And as always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a good one. Thank you.